Now, into every life, a little rain must fall. Here's a great tip. Whenever you paint a plane, and the paint is still wet and soft, don't run home and put the cowling on. Right, Ken?
If you do
Lesson number 2.
You take out the little bolt, but the cowl
doesn't come off.
won't come off.
Oh, man.
I'm afraid I'll take the cowl off and I'll peel the candy color off the whole plane.
You'll be down to raw wood like Midland's. This little helpful tip brought to you by the new finishing editor. I expect to see that in your next column. I know, I've done it. Also, I don't know if he has the tip rate box. Did you figure out how to get it out yet?
No. Haven't even thought about it.
Yeah, you really should paint these things like I always put them on the end of X-Acto knives. That was an oversight on our part. So let's see if you're going to bust this up, taking it apart. Don't try this at home.
Don't want to do that.
Where is it hooked? In the back?
It's right in here somewhere.
Okay,
Everything else is free.
All right, here's the trick. Wait, don't peel the paint because it'll come up like shrimp. Get a double-edged razor blade. You should have one out in the rack. Not a single edge. A double edge is half the thickness.
Here we go.
Get a... Okay, you got the deal? Even if you have to wiggle that down in there. Now, another way, if that seems to be running into resistance, you can always heat it with a torch. A great tip, Stan Powell taught everybody a great trick one time. He had to cut a hatch in his plane at the Nats. He took a double-edged blade and made a hatch. It looked like an incline when he was done. You know, that blade is so thin, it should go right in there. Nope, I hear noise.
There it is.
I hear noise. Let's see if it works. Let's see. You might want it to tell. Which is probably right up on the top where the clear was. It wouldn't be unless you got it all the way in there. Go right around the edge. That might be the ticket. This is the real world of stunt where everything goes wrong. Everything that possibly can will go wrong. Next thing you hear is, 911, get an ambulance. I just cut my nose off. Oh, man. Just go back and forth easy. You can touch that up pretty easy. It's not a problem. You might have to go along the whole edge. I don't know.
I want to be.
I would rather do it. Yeah, I would rather. What a pro. Now let's see where it actually stuck. Down at the bottom.
Right here.
All right, so you can touch that up.
A little bit right here.
Touch that up with a brush. You'll never see it.
So.
All right.
If that's the worst touch-up, we're way ahead of the game.
Yeah. See, you're going to touch this up a million times, time you buff through and sand through it. See, what the problem is, the paint is still soft the day after you do this.
Yeah.
And then the next day, it's still like chewing gum when you put the bolt in.
Well, I was in a hurry to see my plane in all its glory, you know?
Everybody is. But it's a lesson. It's hard to learn, and
I'll bet that guy, Wendy Arnowski, he can always wait. He's patient.
Look, you see my plane over there? Do I put the gas tank in it? Do you see the wheel pants on it? Let it sit there for a month. What the hell do you care?
There's a prop on it?
No, it's
a spinner on it?
That was so we could take phony pictures. Nobody notices in the pictures there's no gas tank on the plane, so I guess it wasn't flown yet. Anyway, it's still good. This paint looks great, by the way.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Oh, man.
And with no clear.
Nice fiberglass cowl option. Nice. That is definitely the way to go. No matter how careful you are, you always wind up with little oversprays or places where the tape was not attached. Now, to get rid of some of them, a good way is just take some old Gorlams and a Q-tip. It's best not to sand it because you don't want to get any sanding scratches on that candy apple. Don't press too hard. Just keep rotating the Q-tip. And you just keep going back and forth until you can get it off. See, you're not hurting anything by doing this. And if you go too far, then you got to touch it up. But you're just basically erasing it. But if you take sandpaper and go over candy apple, a lot of times it makes scratches that you can see in the final finish. No, just
it's coming off slowly.
Yeah, but it's better when it comes off slowly. You don't want to sand it. spot you need to touch up here before we put the clear on too is right in the back of the fuse, a little spot. And you're not going to get it
Over
perfect.
here too.
Yeah, see, the trick with this would have been to keep it thicker and then bring it to a point, not have it gets too thin and then it's just hard to get that point. See, now the way I solved this problem is when I made any of the trim that came to a point, I leave it wide right to the last second and then bring it to a point. Same thing on the fuse. Yeah, leave like a little hook in the back of the paint. That just makes it easier to do. Whenever it's that thin, it's really difficult, and it really gets to be a nuisance to really touch it up and everything. But a little spot you could work on back here. What it is, the paint is so thick here, you must have the tape peeling up. Just keep working on it. You want everything? You want everything like, work on it. Just keep working on it. Jeez. You got quite a bit of paint on it. That's why you don't want to put a dent in it either.
Jerry Sipper never told me about this part of the whole thing. I could just see him coming home from junior high school having me do this.
He likes it better when you do it. Well, this morning I really wanted to see, number one, how this was going to come out. I took the bandage off. Now I noticed a couple things. This is just my quick look at this with all the tape and everything on here. This is a little bit bigger. We did this on the last tape. And believe it or not, even with all these, I don't know if you can see how the tape isn't a real nice surface. I mean, it's certainly not terrible, but the outer shell is really no worse than if you were going over a piece of glass. The outer shell doesn't seem to be bothered. Inside there's a couple little imperfections, and we did pick up the line. Look at this. Can't believe this, we're lucky enough. We picked up the line to cut. There's a line right here. So the next thing is going to be to trim this off. And boy, is this ever light. Next thing is going to be to trim this off and get a little bit of a rough fit onto the fuselage. And just see how close we got to our goal here. Imagine having a cardboard of these. That's what blows my mind. Yeah, I just like to, this is because my eyes are bad, I like to get a little bit of a line on there, even though it's left an impression. And then what I do with the XL blade is hold this as my edge so that I don't get a crazy cut if possible. So you wouldn't have to do this if you were 18 years old and you didn't need glasses. Look at this, I can't even get the line straight. And of course the final little bit I have to get with that sanding belt that's glued to the table. This back little piece, just because it's cracked, this is going to get cut away for the rudder anyway, but this will just keep it from splitting any further while we're working on it. I just let the dust fill in that little gap and just keep hitting it with some thin CA. It doesn't really matter because what's going to happen, the stab is going to cut away much of this, the rudder is going to cut away. We're only going to wind up with a little strip here when this is all done. But I'd like to have it in place. Now I was surprised just how close this comes to being a perfect fit because I really didn't know if this was going to work. Then when you're trying new stuff, I don't know, I think that's half the fun is just trying to get things to work that basically nobody or that you have never done before. No, I did. I just let a little bead of thin CA sit in here. But that's all going to get cut away, so it really doesn't matter. And a lot of times, one of the problems you can have is you're working on something that you're spending a half an hour doing something, and ultimately this is going to get all cut away when we drop the rudder in there anyway, and then we can get a final little pinch to match the fuselage. No, you really, here's a temptation you always have is to want to sand this out in midair like this, and it's really thin and delicate. But what happens if you put it right back on the metal mold? Now it's a joy to sand. Now, in fact, I turned the bench on. Now you can sand it, get any little imperfections out of it, any greasiness. It's always a good idea to sand the wood a little bit before you make the mold, but there's always some little impressions that are left by the bandage or just by the imperfections in the wood. Having it on the mold, beautiful. There's so many little tricks or little tips or whatever you want to call it. They work to your favor. If you had to carve this piece out of a solid piece of wood and hollow it, by now you'd be 2 weeks later. And you'd always have little spots where you're going through. The grain would be going in the wrong direction. You'd have to leave it at least 1/8 of an inch. And when we're done here, this isn't going to be much more than a 1/16. It'll probably be somewhere between 3/32 and a 1/16. Not only that, I think right now I'm way ahead of somebody that started carving a block. I mean, not a little bit ahead, I'm a lot ahead. I don't want to do a tremendous sanding, I just want to make it smooth, as nice as I can. And I want to take it off the mold. I want to go over to the bench and get this level. Then I'll true up this edge on this sander and true up this edge. Now again, this is just sticky back sandpaper you buy on a roll. All of those woodworker catalog places seem to sell it. By the way, this might be something good for Brodak to consider selling. Now, obviously, one of the things you have now, if you wanted to change the shape some for a custom plane, say you're designing this, you could lower this end, you could lower this end, make it more rakish short. You could lower the whole thing. You got about 5 different options you can use here with the same mold. You can also make the part bigger and smaller. You can make the part out of 2 pieces of 1/16 with fiberglass cloth in between, like we did on the original Spitfire. Having these molds, we're just starting to explore all the possibilities. I have a little glitch in the line. I also have a piece of rough paper. This is a sanding belt that's glued down. It's not self-stick. The rough belt will just get the edge screwed up. Then you can go over to the fine belt and get a final cut on it. Another little technique, you can hold your hand in one spot when you're going to get the final little amount off. Just lets you get a pretty nice line. I've been trimming this with a little sanding block till I get a nice fit on both sides. I want both sides to be a nice fit. And what I'll do, I'll just put some masking tape up here, hold this in position, and I can go back and trim the back. Now it's handy all through construction to be able to take the parts apart almost like a plastic model. The tape helps you do that, so you can get all your wood fits. The whole idea is to get as many of the wood fits before we start building the wing. you can see we have a little bit of extra material at the back. I want to get this taped all the way down and then just block sand that fit in. Now with the tape holding it on, I'll just let it hang off the table and block sand that ledge perfectly flat before I start making the rudder up. I'm trying to maintain a nice 90-degree angle to the fuselage top because that's going to be the rudder hinge line. And this should give me a relatively accurate. Now we're at the point, if this was going to be a normal plane, normal being a non-I-beamer, I don't know that I would have done this any different, but I have some details to take care of. I have to obviously figure a cowl and all the ducting and things that go in the nose, but because today's session is kind of limited, what I want to do is I want to pick a job that I can work on today. This will be a day I'd like to have a full day to work on that. The back piece of making the rudder should only be maybe it will be more than a day. But I want to lay out the rudder, and that's the next thing. And I want to make this one is going to be a little bit different than the other ones. Now this is the rudder shape for the early Spits. These were the early ones, had this rather roundish rudder. And if you notice, the rudder has ribs and it's fabric covered, but the fin doesn't. And even on the one that we modeled, and we modeled the late model Spitfire and Seafire, the rudder itself is always fabric covered. Here's the late model rudder, and here's the model. But I want to do the early model Spits. The earlies, the 1s to 5s, had that rounded rudder. And really, my basic motive is I just want to make each one a little bit different. Well, it's kind of like children. Each one will have a little personality. Each one will have a little bit different paint job. And we don't even have a clue what we're going to do about painting this. But I know, just thinking of some of the options, desert paint jobs, Reno air racers. Now, if you do a lot of reading about Spitfires, most of the people that actually flew Spitfires thought that the early model ones were like, let's put quotation marks around it, the real Spitfires. They maneuvered well, they were very light, very nimble, very agile. The later model ones and the Seafires were very overpowered, very heavy, and not really super maneuverable. So we're almost modeling a different plane than the original run. Well, here's a nice close-up. You can see the rib locations, the rudder and rib locations. The early model one, and that's what we're going to be modeling. Now there's also another variation, and this is the one that Joe Adamusco modeled with his Seafire. There's actually three. There are actually 4 if you count the Spitfire, the late model Seafire one. And this is the 4th type. Now, what typically happens is as the power increases, the rudder gets bigger. That's the way it usually works in the real planes. And of course, they're making up for the fact that the real late model ones did not have a turtle deck, so they had to make up for some of that side area. More power, bigger fin and rudder. Gives you a pretty nice look at how a late model Seafire rudder would come apart, actually. Now, I don't know if I'm really stating the case accurately, but I think the early model Spits, the 1s to 5s, are the ones that are really given most of the lion's share of the credit of defeating the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. And most of them had that early model rudder. Now, I'm going to try to be... This is where it gets difficult. Without the books, you're just doing this from eye. But if you have the books, you can really come up with, lots of choices, and then you're really not making a scale model, but one that really simulates one of the spits that you want to model. Here's one of the ones. This is actually in the Battle of Britain Museum. Well, the nice thing is, if all else fails, I have these color reproductions from the magazines. And these really are good at, you get the rib spacing, get the overall look of the rudder. What's significant, I really want to take it into account when I lay this out on the early one, is this radius in here is really almost like a filleted area. I don't know if I'm going to be able to really get the curve right, but to get that in kind of a scale look, it really, if you just brought this line down and did a little baby radius there, you'd kind of lose the look of the rudder. Well, here's where the book that's in Japanese that the John Brodak sent me comes in real handy. This is where having even one book like this can just change your whole approach to the modeling world, because now you can get the details out of it. You don't have to make them up. You don't have to invent ink lines. You can do them in a scale way. And here you can get kind of a realistic look at just how that back piece, where the rib spacing will be. Just one other thought, the early model Spitz had a little bit different counterbalance on the elevators too, which we're going to be changing the whole tail, so at the same time we can change that. Get a good look at the rivet location, the rib location, and obviously the rivets all follow formers. You see a lot of people do ink lines, and they're just drawing pine trees and toilets, anything that's on that drafting thing, just inventing things. Well, if you even try a little bit to keep it scale, it really will look more like a real airplane. An interesting variation, one of the early model Spitz with a seaplane. This is the one they made for Sweden, I believe, and they only made one. With that lower rudder, it looks like a Tucker Special. Anyway, that's where they got with the Tucker Special, or the S2. That's where they got the ideas from those racing seaplanes. But always something you can use on a model. The P is indicating that it's a prototype model. But anywhere you can get these ideas, just to make them more and more and more in keeping with the scale plane, assuming that that's what you want to do. And one of the thoughts Joe always had was to do a clip wing version of 5. This is an early model clip wing version with the rounded rudder, flying with the cockpit open. Hey, look at some of the different exhaust manifolds, the fishtail exhausts, some of the detailing in this book. This is really some nice book. One of the early versions that didn't even have a Malcolm hood. Even a different set of exhaust manifolds on that one. Well, one thought occurred to me, if we're going to do an early model Spit, we can do these Siamese, actually 2 cylinders exhaust into one header. John, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the book. I'm using it. I'm using it every day now. Coming up with ideas. In fact, I'm speaking fluent Japanese. See, the detail book really shows you when you really want to do any kind of scale detailing. Boy, there you have it. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to lay out the ribs and the rudder. And one of the things it's not really practical to lay out. If we were doing a scale model, we'd lay all the little linkage for the trim tabs and everything, but I'd like to get, similar to the Spitfire, I'd like to get the rib location kind of scale looking. I don't want to get it, too far off scale anyway. I'm going to tell you, this is one of the best books I've had for detailing. If we're going to do Siamese exhaust, just get a look at this. Look at the Siamese exhaust. And of course we'll make a mold, we'll carve a plug, finish it. course, they got the fishtail. There's a lot of choices. When you're doing an early model split, this will kind of be an interesting project because a lot of the stuff is almost the same but not the same. Even the scoop. Here's the scoop. The air intake scoop is a whole lot different because, of course, the motor, the engine, the plumbing going to the engine was totally different. Now, I know down in the Dayton Air Museum they have one of these early model splits, and maybe when we go out to Muncie, we'll go out a day early so I can get some real video, photographs, whatever, of real close-up detailing. But having these books is the next best thing. And having friends that are willing to share it with you. That's the whole fun of doing this. If you were doing this living all by yourself in the middle of an igloo somewhere in South America, you wouldn't enjoy it as much as if you have this interaction with other people. I know there's at least 15 or 20 people that have sent me more than one book, that they're constantly looking around for things that we can exchange and share. So this is one of the things I'm definitely going to consider, is coming up with some real slick-looking exhaust thing for this plane. Notice another thing, the early models have a whole different spinner shape. It's not parabolic, it's more like a true turn, or like actually this is almost like one of the plastic spinners. So we still have so many choices. This is the whole thing with doing Spitfires. When you do a Spitfire, you have so many choices, you can almost custom make a model any way you want. And when you have these books with all the details in them, oh. Okay, I can start laying this out by using last year's plan, put a nice sheet of Mylar, and just get this roughed in. Now, because the fuselage is longer, the rudder in effect will be further back. This will just give me a rough idea of what I want to start with for my shape. To get the bottom block on here, I taped that on just to get a rough. I'm going to have to put a little filler block in there, but I still want to have a rough idea where this rudder is going to wind up. I just want to rough this out as much as I can. Because the rest of it really, unless you do a photo enlargement, the rest of it is by eye. See, we've done this before, so we know this is not going to be a very quick. You just get the curve here. This is almost a constant curve. Doesn't rake forward as much as the older rudder. Usually this takes about 5 shots at doing this. 15. Now I can see just by looking at that, I'm too small and too short. So I can increase this. And what I want to do is start cutting these out. Make a little tracing. Until I get the proportion that I want. I think it's this curve up here that's the most difficult to get into proportion. Now see, from looking at this looks like it's too thin. The test is always, want to put about 1/4 of an inch down underneath. The test is always to draw it up like this, because it's got to be in proportion. It really isn't a photo enlargement. And then make the corrections you need just by making it over and over on colored paper and see what's wrong with each shape. And you have to basically do this, unless you're copying a plan, you have to basically do this when you make any stunt ship. Is it too big? Is it too small? Now if I look at this and I look at the scale picture, what I see is wrong is I need more of a cut off the top here to make this scale, or more scale. what I can basically do is now just start sketching in and removing material little by little. If I cut too much, I'll go make another pattern. Little by little, sneaking up on what it's going to look like. Now, just by looking at this, I can see what's wrong is I have this curve wrong. I need to bring this back out a little bit. So I'll just make up another pattern and add this material to it. Well, looking at this, I know I want to just add some material here. The rest of it I can just leave pretty similar. And I can start nipping away at this. This is a constant curve on the scale of the model Spitz. It's a constant curve. It never has a flat spot. Now, it looks like this could even come out a little bit more. You can see how just one little change in the rudder makes a dramatic change in the way the plane looks. And we're trying to maintain some semblance of keeping it a scale plane too, but here's a question. You just go back and forth and you again and again you can see just how much of a little change makes a big change in the way the plane looks. Kind of satisfied with this, except that I still need to bring this a little bit further back. I want to make up a little more here, a little more of a curve. And I want to drop this down into the fuselage so I have some material to work with. And I'll just make a continuation of this curve here. There's so much back and forth on a rudder. This is one of the things that just seems like you never get it exactly the way you want. Because if you're making a scale model, you just photo enlarge it and you're done. But you can't really do that on a stunt ship because you lose the look. You get the proportion right, but then it's not, the wing is a different shape. It doesn't coordinate with the wing and the fuselage. It seems like every time I do this, it's the same old thing. I'm making rudder after rudder after rudder, but eventually I get it to where I'm satisfied with it. And then I can go on to drawing some plans. So just to get the proportion, this is what's happening, is this is turning out to be a much girthier fuselage. And I need to get that right. Now that looks pretty close. It's going to drop down into the top block of about 1/8 of an inch. That'll even up the back. And I need to slant it back just the way, I've got it taped on there quicker, but just to get the proportions right. So important, get the proportions right early. Now the first thing I have to do is figure out the fin and build up the fin. Attach the fin to the top block, and then I can get the rudder made out, because what's going to happen, I'm going to wind up at the bottom. I don't want to have it too big or too small. This is all going to have ribs in it. I want to lay those ribs out 90 degrees to the back spar. It seems like it's a lot of extra work, but to get these proportions, it just constantly is shavings and changing, and I know these curves didn't look just right. It just takes time. And I remember, if I go back on the video, I remember making this rudder shape up. This was a very, very time-consuming operation to make that rudder, but it was well worth it. When you think of how much time goes into one of these models, getting it right is really worth it. Now I need to get the hinge line right and this little counterbalancer right. It's a proportional thing. Now, from looking at it, you got to look at it a couple times before you decide if you have it right. From this, it doesn't look like it's right. Looks like it needs to be thinner up here. moving the hinge line forward about 3/16 of an inch, it looks like then this proportion looks right. And even, actually this even looks better. So I'm going to just move the hinge line up, make a tracing of this on Mylar, and that'll be my final part for making out the plans. Now with that hinge line moved forward, well, you can see it's about 3/16 of an inch. The proportion looks, I guess, just about as good as I'm going to get it for this point. Just a little thing of just how this evolved into what I hope is going to be a very scale-like shape and still be aerodynamically right, because we basically haven't changed any of the square inch areas, and we know they were real good on both of the previous planes. So okay, now I'm going to cut this piece out, and then I'm going to construct this piece, attach this piece to the top block, because then I can get this final. I know I've put this on already, but this is so significant because a lot of times you build this whole ready, you put it on and it doesn't match up at the bottom. It's like a wingtip and a flap. You want to do that last carving. I guess part of what you can pick up off the video, and I don't really realize it because it's something I don't think about often, is the sequence of things so that you wind up with this cut just right. Otherwise, you're making all these parts, and when you get them together, if the fuselage ends here and this isn't right, you have a problem. Sequencing is kind of an important thing in this. Now what I want to do, since I can't cut this all out of one piece, I want to have the grain in the front going parallel to the leading edge, have the seam go in the corner, and have the grain in this dimension going straight up and down. Now the reason for doing that is simple. I don't want to have a rough edge here that's hard to finish, and I don't want to have, when you have grain coming in the wrong direction, this edge here would be difficult to get a nice smooth curve in. So this will, as long as I'm going to have a seam, let it be on an angle. This gives me the most strength vertically and a nice seam in the front, the nice edge. So what I did, I laid the pieces out in some 3/8 balsa. This will just be a solid piece of wood because it's going to have a tremendous taper in it. It might be okay to build it up if you were going to leave it flat, but since this is going to be thicker than both the Spitfire and the Seafire, at some point you've got so much of an airfoil in it that it's almost worthless to build it up. You're not going to save that much. So this will have a lot of carbon and sand in it before I actually get the final shape. Now, next thing is to true up all the edges on that sanding belt that's glued to the table, and join the pieces. Try to get a nice, even, straight glue seam. Now, if the real airplane had a rib fin, of course, we'd be making a rib fin, but this is kind of keeping in the true scale tradition. The fin is aluminum covered. The rudder is fabric covered, so this will be kind of a good replication, similar to the Seafire. Okay, next step, get a center line on this, and I can start the carving operation. Want to work off a center line though for the whole part. So what I always like to do is work toward one side of the center line. Well, it goes without saying, get a new blade and a knife. Now it's a help to us that we have the grain going this way, because now we should get a real nice edge exactly where they're going to see the edge. That'll be the most obvious thing when you look at the back of the plane from the front. This is where A nice long blade comes in handy. You can take ice shavings off. Been real happy using these XL blades. They really are nice and sharp. In fact, they're so sharp I cut my... Oh, son of a gun. Let's cut my finger again. Can you believe that? They are sharp. Trust me. The key to any of this is to work symmetrically. Take a little bit off one side. Nice little ice shaving, especially when you're doing curves. And try not to be a windy and chop your finger off. Look at this, I'm bleeding to death here. Look at this, I really did cut myself. This is terrible. Help, help.
Here's where I find those plug-McKnight sanding sticks so handy, because I'm trying to get a curve. And if you're trying to use a block, you're really not going to get a curve. The smaller, actually I've got even smaller ones than this, get right in there and get that airfoil shape. And of course what I'm trying to do is look down the top and make sure I'm not making one side thinner than the other. These are really handy. If you've never used these, run out and buy a pack. These are just... I'd like to give plug-McKnight a big hug and kiss. Well, not really. Always use your hands, pick up any little imperfections. You can feel right away. I also want to get a little bit of a taper up here. I don't want this to be the same thickness at the top as the bottom. And that I can do with the block. I can reference off the back to see how much I'm taking off. Work one side. Now you can see I'm getting thinner on this side. Now I can work this side a little bit. Just trying to put the taper in just like the real plane would have. The real plane wouldn't be the same thickness down at the fuselage as it would up at the tip. Now when you get down to having it nice and thin like that, obviously you run a bead of thin CA along both sides to harden up the wood, or else it's going to be so vulnerable, so delicate. And then what I like, it just turns out a kicker bottle is just about the right dimension. I like to get a radius back on everything, because it winds up, sanding it out, it winds up being a little bit like a razor blade. Kicker bottle has just about the right radius.
What I'm trying to do is, I have most of the airfoil in here, is to get an accurate notch in here, but what I need to do at the very back is take a little more material than I need, because this wants to all disappear into this thickness. But before I glue this on permanently, I want to make sure I just tacked it in place. I don't want to have the rudder laying off to one side or the other, so it's a good idea to just put, it's a little bit off to this side now. Before you put a permanent glue seam, get it tacked in position. I also want to make sure need a little bit, I don't want to have it off a whole lot, because scale it looks like it's almost touching. Always tack it first, then check it. I had to make up a little filler block in here because this just didn't marry up exactly with the curve I wanted. I want a continuous curve. I didn't want it to come down and have a point. It's just a question. A good thing for sanding this in is that kicker jar.
Now it's almost lunchtime, and I'm just going to finish this up by, well, I just put a couple of coats of thick CA down in here to harden the wood up, get a fillet started. I want to try to make as much of the fillet out of thick CA as I can. Then I want to get in here with a Dremel tool and cut out all the extra wood that I don't need. Get a final sanding on this, and that'll probably be it for today. I want to go over and do some work by Kenny's shop, but at least we have this much done, and it's nice. Just knowing that we're this much ahead of the game now. Always like to look at it before I quit for the day. Well, next time we get to do some work down here, we'll work on that rudder. Get some more CA on that fillet, work that fillet out. It does look like this is going to work out real nice though. I spent a little extra time here. I got all the wood all over the Dremel tool. You can see how it's pretty much like a birch bark canoe, in fact. Worked on this fillet with a couple of coats of thick CA. Just try to get it roughed in because I want to get the rudder. I guess tomorrow's session we'll get the rudder, or try to get the rudder here. Anyway, every time I pick this up it's the same thing. Okay, the end of a good session. Okay, Dave Royer sent in some photos of his smoothie. I'm reading a little note that he sent with it. Smoothie built from 1952 Air Trails plan, all SIG dope except for a little extra pigment from Windy, 36 ounces, Fox 35. Said he's still working on the CG. In today's mail, I got an unbelievable find. This is the kind of stuff you almost never come across. I got a whole bunch of old Ektachrome slides from Jim Tishy. Now, Jim, of course, is one of our favorite friends here for submitting this stuff, but what it is, these are all on old Ektachrome slides. I don't have any way of knowing what year it is, but I'll try to identify any of the planes I can from the photos. I set up a little lamp here to try to get these on video. I don't know how good this is going to work out, but relative to nobody being able to ever see these, or something happening that Jim lost them in the mail, they'll be forever preserved if we can get them on this video. And there's some real neat stuff in here. Now it looks like just some of the things I can identify. This looks like Jerry Sipper's Nobler, and it may or may not be. And this looks like one of John Havel's old planes, the one that he had at the 62 Nats. Some kind of a little air show here. Again, I don't really know a lot of the people in the videos, but boy, you can get some ideas for your next paint job or for your next, and look at these props. I love these painted props. Look at this one off to the right. Some nice ideas for paint jobs right here. Now, I don't know how this is going to work out, or what kind of quality we're going to get on the video, but hey, it's certainly, when you think of the options are you have things on slides. It's really inconvenient to show them. This way you can just pop it right in the tape, right in the VCR, and go watch them. And I will, of course, give a copy of this tape to Jim for his records and thank him ahead of time. We got quite a few of these things. I want to get them all on one tape and share it with him. These are just great. Remember, these were the old days when you could just buy Vico spinners over the counter. Ugh.
Nice bite. Another person that has a million of the slides is John Misk. I gotta get together with him someday and get all his slides on 1 or 2 videotapes. Boy, would that be a chore. Beautiful. Look at the old RC planes, the old Orions. Wow, this is a classic example of one. Upright engines, painted wood props, tricycle gear. All these things are now obsolete. Very nostalgic. Reminds you of the old days in the hangars at the Nats. They had the Navy Nats. Things just hanging everywhere. The model airplane, model aviation was a much bigger event than it is today. Look at the Shark 45 roof here on the right. Look at the Shark 45. This plane, even I remember. This is Jerry Sipper's Palomino. I guess built along the lines of a Nova, but modified. Nice paint job, exotic looking paintwork. Not sure who this plane is, but it's beautiful. It's so nice to see these planes. So nice to know that this stuff will be immortalized now, or hopefully immortalized. Even if my house gets hit with a nuclear weapon, somebody out in the real world will have a copy of this floating around. Look at the detail on the cockpit on this. And it is a nice painted prop, and I thought I was the only one in the world still painting props. Nice cowling too, look at cowling. Flake fuselage on an I-beamer. Got John Havel's playing in the background here. At least a paint job. Look at this, the phone even rings when I'm doing photography. There's props. They're hand-carved, handmade props. Well, I'm just thinking about anybody that has some old slides or old pictures, anything they want to immortalize here, I'll be glad to put it on one of my tapes and give you a free copy. Please, send it in. That sure has the look of John Hable's plane. Nice spinner, too. Now, if I'm remembering right, maybe I'm not remembering right, this was an old Berkeley kit, and I remember somebody flying this at all the East Coast contests. This thing really flew well. Jerry Sipper's Palomino, another shot. It's like a really nicely finished Nova. Now, if this may be a real Novi, I don't really know. But there's a funny story about how they were flying over grass one day, and this obviously is they were flying over grass. And somebody went to hand launch the plane, this Dave Gorky's plane, or Kostecki's plane, I'm sorry. And when he hand launched it, one of these points caught on the guy's belt loop, and the plane just hung there, flapping out in front of him. I don't really know if that's true, but it sounds like the kind of thing that could and would happen. Hit a mobile prop. Again, I really want to thank Jim Tishy. Really, this is the end of this, for sharing this. It really was a nostalgic trip back, and I really do appreciate it. I always love those wheels with the little circles painted on them. Well, I got a little bit of time today. Hey, really appreciate those pictures. A little bit of time today. I want to lay out the rudder if I can. I'm trying to do this in drips and drabs. I guess construction won't be a whole lot different than what we used here. I don't see any reason to change a whole lot of this. I'll make a core out of 3/32 wood, put some little ridges and edges on it. These are the things that you can do to make your life easier, though, is when you get down to this part,
make sure you make the bottom a little bit longer than it has to be, because if you make this and it's too short, it's hard to go into a hollow block. You wind up having a problem. It's an eighth of an inch too big. When it's all assembled and it's all ready to go, you can sand that last little bit away, but it's really difficult if that piece is too short, and I've done that many times. I wind up the day I'm going to assemble a plane that this is like this, and I say, now how do you carve that, and you get a funny little edge in there and everything. So it's always good when I'm laying this out, I'll make this bottom piece, just similar to what I did on a Seaflyer, make this piece just a little bit longer. Just a cheap little insurance policy doing it that way. Okay, now step one I want to do is lay out a core. I don't want to put this piece on. This piece I want the grain going in this direction, this little tip. Now if you make this all out of one piece, which is very tempting to do, what happens, this tip here gets very, very delicate. So to avoid that, I'm going to make a lap joint. I'll just leave this piece off for now, trace out the bottom, and this will be a separate block. Now what I'm going to do, just for safety's sake here, I line this up. I know this is where it's really going to end, but I want to leave myself an extra little bit here. I don't want to get down to the nitty-gritty on this. A lot of times when you line this up, you need to sand the blocks to get a nice tight fit, and this can get distorted just like the end of a wingtip. So rather than fool around, I'm going to add this little bit, and boy, that is just a little safety factor. There's the piece with a little bit extra down at the bottom. I want to true all the edges up before I go on to the next part of the laying this out. And this is not any kind of new fancy technology. This is stuff that's been around, using a core to make a part and then hollowing it out, or you can gouge it out, put lightning holes, whatever. But we need this piece, number one, at least to send a center line on everything and some place to sink our hinges into. Okay, now I just want to put a dot on wherever I want a rib to be. Again, I want this to look as much like the I-beam ring will look. That's one of the thoughts anyway. This will be a block down here. Now the rest of these will be centered. Or I can work off an edge. I can work either way on this. The idea is to get a nice even spacing, something that's going to look, well, the real rudder is built up. It's fabric covered, but not really all that crazy about making it scale, but I would like to have it that at least it looks similar to the prototype being fabric covered. And it'll kind of match the ring too, and it's all put together and buffed out. Just thinking about something, I wonder how many people have collections of old photos and they only have one copy of them. I want to strip off some wood for, it's a little bit wider than an 1/8 inch, so I can put a kind of a radius on the front. This will be the up and down spar on the fin. A little bit thinner than 1/4 inch in this dimension. I glued that piece, just tack it on, and I want to carry all these lines over to the other side. Otherwise what happens when you look from the back, the ribs won't line up. You really want to make sure these lines are exactly touching in the back, I guess in the back more even than the front, but both sides. Use the same tri-square, just carry them right over. Before I draw each one, I kind of look down and see. Make sure it lines up. If you've ever done any work with I-beams, making I-beam flaps or anything, you know if those ribs don't line up, it really looks hokey. Now I just like to just tack it. Don't make a permanent glue seam until everything is maybe 1 in the middle too. Till I have this whole thing laid out, because I'm making it plenty oversized that I can cut that airfoil into it, that nice airfoil to let the I-beam ribs really show nicely. Now, in these two blocks on the bottom, I want the grain going front to back. This will stiffen the part up quite a bit. And since most of this is going to be carved away, I'll just wind up with a sandwich. I'll make 2 pieces, 1 for each side. But for sure, you want the grain going front to back. If you don't have the grain going the way you want it on a job like this, when you're making something when it's all done, it's really like a free flight plane. It's very light and flimsy and delicate. And the grain, if you don't use the grain to your advantage, it's really a problem. Later on, it'll twist and bend. You put it in the sun, and the trim on it the trim will be changing constantly. Now, you want to maximize the grain, always going in the direction that's going to serve your purpose. Now, I like to get a little, look at this dropsy thing here. Make it just a little bit oversized in every dimension. And the purpose of that is I can come by and block sand that right in. When you're trying to laminate 2 pieces together and get a perfect fit, make one oversize and sand it in. It's a lot easier than trying to match up 2 pieces while the glue is drying. You know, I'll sand this in and then just replicate it on this side. Once you get that edge, how nice that block sands in like that. If you try to match those pieces up, you really never get it perfect anyway. And I'll trace that part out onto here. I always like to leave a little bit extra in there. Another thing too is when you're going to get that last little bit, the sanding block makes it a perfectly true surface instead of having one where maybe this would be the edge and you got a little ratty edge or something. Just adds a nice little detail touch when you can do that. Real important is to get these lined up. So from the back, all these parts, I have one down and one up. When that's all carved and sanded in, it's very important that from the back, it's lined up. Now a sanding block will just let me get that right down, right, exactly perfect. Now I know the top of this is going to taper to just about 1/4 of an inch, so I can probably get away with using 1 piece 1/4 inch here. Now I have to make sure, this is all going to get tapered. I'm going to make sure I get this centered before I tack it, and again, best idea here is tack everything. Don't give everything a permanent glue joint until you're happy that everything is the way you want it. Now the next thing I want to do is lay out the back edge here. Roughly 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little more than 1/8 inch. 3/16 or so, so I have some room to taper it back. Now it's a help if you make 2 parallel lines to work the shape off, because otherwise when you get to the corners, here's what happens. You wind up getting to the corners here and these pieces don't have a nice fit. And of course always cut them a little bit oversized. Now if you wanted to really be accurate, you could lay out a piece of tape on this curve. And it's safe to say you can do this by eye, but if you're in doubt, just make 2 of them up. Make them up a little bit oversized. See, now by having that piece just a little bit oversized, I can block sand it in until you get a nice tight fit there. Because if you had one of these deals where it was, you're going to see that in the final finish. I like to get that nice and even. another good use for a Bud McKnight sanding stick. Just get it till it's a nice tight fit. I have just enough hanging out over the edge that I can block sand this whole thing down. And the next step, I want to get a center line on everything. Right around the whole perimeter of the part. And that gives me a center line to work with. Now what I really have to check here, I have to get the fuselage over here. I have to start lining up and getting some rough idea just how thick this part is going to be in the back of the plane. And what I'll do is pin this on. See, I've got a little bit of an angle up here that's not correct. I want to fix that angle. And then I want to trace around the whole perimeter here so I know how thick this part has to be. So when I mate it up to the fuselage, I don't have it that it's either too thick or too thin. Okay, we finally have that fit acceptable. Now, of course, I want to get the true curve in here. But most of all, it's this thickness that I want to address right now. And I still got a little bit of extra material to grind with here. Boy, don't cheat yourself and make that too short. But once you get this edge exactly right, it's a good idea, especially on end grain. Seal it up with thin CA. Let it harden, and what it does, it gives you a nice edge to work with. You're not constantly ruining that edge. Now with this pinned in position and held in neutral, I can go right down here, pick up the thickness. Again, down here I have to kind of do a little interpolation. And just figure out what the bottom of this. So now I have a rough idea what shape I want this to be. I could even do this by eye if I wanted to, but just roughly I know I can carve that away before I lay in the ribs. It wouldn't be a bad idea to just leave the line on, leave a little bit of the extra material on there. Just give me an idea how thick this is going to be as it tapers down the fuselage, because it's not a constant section. I'll just take a little material off here just to rough this out. Get a rough idea what this shape is going to look like when it's done. Trying to work a little, just get a little bit of a radius in here before I put the ribs. The more of this you can shake before you put the ribs in, the easier it'll, actually the easier I think it's going to be. Now this is all I'm going to get done in this session. But it'll give me some time tonight to think about other things, dream about other Spitfires. Now tomorrow, get to make up the little ribs, get all this sanded in. See, I always like to think about, I need to make the rudder linkage. I like to think about things at the end of the day, what I'm going to do the next day. So, having said that, I hear the lovely wife upstairs telling me it's supper time. It's supper time. I always like to, at the end of the day, just get some idea of how the project's going. I think we really have captured the look that we're looking for, this early model Spit. today I ran into a funny little dilemma that I'm going to try to solve. I remember, this was a while back, Ed Gallagher sent me this Kevlar. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to make up a mock-up cowling, even though I know this cowling is not going to fit because this fuselage is a little bit wider. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it up unless I do some fancy manipulating. I don't know if I can do that. But what I want to do, since I don't have any cowlings in stock, all of them have been sold, I wanted to make up a, this is a good day to do it. I have to finish the rudder so I can have this sitting drying overnight while I'm finishing the rudder. See, it's like a time management thing. Now, if you've ever cut Kevlar, just a quick thing. Kevlar, if you have a pair of scissors, you ruin the scissors cutting it. It's almost impossible to cut with scissors. It's really a nuisance. A razor blade will last about 2 inches and then it's dull. It's really annoying, but being we're waiting for XL to get back to me, John Burdak was going to try to come up with some idea or some XL scissors that would be appropriate. Anyway, I figured this would be a great time to just lay up one of these cowls in Kevlar. I also have some 6-ounce carbon mat. So in the meantime, if it takes me 1 day or 2 days to finish the rudder, what I'll have is 2 prototype cowlings that I can use for fitting, whatever, decide if I'm going to have to make a whole new cowling mold or not. And I know this is not appropriate material to use in a nobler cowling. Problem with a nobler cowling being that the curves are so accented in here that it really doesn't want to conform to the curves conveniently, but the Spitfire cowl, the old Spitfire cowl, let me just show this. The old Spitfire cowl, what I did, I cut a piece of this before, and believe me, it took about 10 minutes to cut this stuff. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that to conform in there. Now, Ed has sent me a couple little instructions with this, and he said wet it out with some thin resin. But of course, I want to put some Cabasil in the corners first. But anyway, this will be an interesting experiment. Look at this, it almost takes the shape. This will be an interesting experiment because we have never laid one of these up. And I don't know if we're going to be able to. And this will be a good prelude. If this doesn't work, there's no point wasting the carbon. But if I can get this one to come out, then it'll be worth trying that 6-ounce carbon fiber that we got from George Spar. Now, as I always do, get the corners, put a little bit of Cabasil in with the epoxy, make up a little paste batch, get down in the corners. Again, we really have nothing to lose here, and we're probably going to have to make the mold plug up anyway over. Maybe we'll even make a different cowling shape, but this at least gives us one more choice. I'd like to experiment with this. Now, it isn't really practical in a nobler mold because of the compound curves, but the Spits, the Spitfires, even the Cardinals, you can get away with this. Problem with Kevlar, and of course that's the material that they make bulletproof vests out of, there's really only one major problem. Really expensive. It's about $40 a yard instead of like 17 or 15 or whatever the other good quality stuff is. The other problem is it doesn't like to bend because it's made to make bulletproof vests out of, and boats and things. It doesn't really like to go around compound curves as well as other material. Anyway, we'll give this a shot. It'll be an interesting experiment. And that's another point you can always take into account is sometimes it's worth doing things just for an experiment. See, trying to wet this out is difficult. It's a lot more difficult than e-glass. So if you were just starting in at doing some kind of molding, you wouldn't want to start using Kevlar. Start and do all your practicing with good old-fashioned e-glass, the white stuff. Kevlar is yellow in color. But again, it's always worth it to do the experiments. Now I decided I'd try to make this a little bit oversized here. What I had in mind, kind of a sneaky thing, I was going to make the cowl and then put another layer on the outside if I could to make it a little bit thicker. But we'll see when we pull this out of the plug. This will be our experimental one. See, it's really difficult to get this to conform to the shape. I've had to take a razor blade and try to put slits in this. It's hard to even cut this with a double-edged razor, so looking forward to seeing if John can get us any information on cutting Kevlar in case we decide we want to use this in the future. It certainly is a little bit higher tech material than using e-grass, but again, the problem is the workability and the price, but hey, you're always better off if you can do a little test or experiment. At least find out that there are some downsides you don't want to live with. Really is difficult getting this stuff to conform. Now, one of the ways you could get around this would be to sit here for an hour or so while this is kicking off, turning into cheese, and just keep patting it down, but I don't want to spend that hour. Time is really short, really limited here. So I'm just going to let this rest in place and get working. I got a little time left. I could work on a Rudder this afternoon. Difficult. Now you can see that's about as good as I can get it to lay down. I've even I've worn out about 6 razor blades and trying to use every trick in the book to get this stuff to lay down, but I have a feeling if you really wanted to put the push on here, the only way is going to be to sit here. In fact, what I'll do while I'm working on the Rudder, I'll leave this box out here and just keep hammering it down. But look at this stuff. This is the reason they make big racing boats, offshore racing boats and stuff out of Kevlar. Of course, it's a little different environment than what we have here in the shop, and the budget is usually talking about boats that are a couple of $100,000. So the advantage of Kevlar, it's a lot stronger than e-glass, roughly double the strength. But again, the problems of using it, especially in modeling where you need to practice and you need to develop little techniques and stuff, this may or may not be worth it. And certainly if this doesn't work, it gives me a good indication that the carbon fiber that's even thicker than this and more difficult to bend around corners might almost not be worth giving a try to, but I always like to give it the old pull-lock try, right to the very end. Alright, that's about all I'm going to do with this. This is ready to put on a shelf.
The Georgia team, father and son. Unfortunately, a bad ignition module kept these guys out of the competition. They managed one takeoff in all 4 rounds. Of course, the third round.
Giorgino sent this in to me.
So one takeoff in 3 rounds.
This is from Top Gun.
Airplane, and they would have done some damage.
I thought I'd enjoy this. And what was cool is, right after this, there's a Focke
The module failed. They could not deliver the
Spitfire
time, and unfortunately,
There's a Focke Wolf. I figured I'd put it on being John is making a model. John Brodak's making a model with a 190. There's a real nice 190 on here.
who knows? But
You never have too many videos. Buy them all. Buy everybody's videos. Enjoy them all. Hey, make a better landing than that.
the gentleman on
Look
that
at
left
this.
is
Oh,
Jim
man.
Wilkinson. And over the years, you've got
John, this is for you.
Stuka very well. That is one airplane that's always been one of my favorites.
Look at the
especially
cockpit detail. Look at the paintwork.
with it. This year, the time on Jim Stuka ran out. He has met the 3-year rule, so the Stuka could not fly this year. And we've got a new one, and it's a beauty. Tell us about it, Jim.
Yeah, you're right. The 3-year limit ran out on my Stuka. As much as I love that aircraft, and it's in my workshop, safe and well. I don't fly it too much. This year I decided to do another German aircraft, and I did the Focke-Wulf 190 A8 plans by Don Smith. It's a totally scratch-built aircraft, all wood, fiberglass covered, lacquer primer.
Look at the rudder, just what we're working on. Hey,
The paint
cool.
job is automotive acrylic enamel. The entire aircraft was airbrushed with a Pache airbrush, including all the lettering, the numbers, the swastikas, etc. There are no decals on this. The landing gear was designed by me. I prototyped it out of wood. I used skill screwdriver, electric screwdriver motors, driving a 1/4-20 threaded rod, and it lifts the wheels, which the whole wheel package, each one weighs about 1.5 pounds. I also prototyped the scale tail wheel, and then I machined all the parts
Oh, look at this. Look at this.
milling machine.
This is great. Look at the details. John, I hope you appreciate this. I went through 4 hours of video to find this for you.
It's a maintenance store.
Anyway,
I have a step comes down, the canopy slides. I have a belly tank.
look at the detailing.
Well, thank you, Jim, and best of luck with Top Gun this this year.
All right, best of luck, John Brodak. Get that 190. All right, back to making this rudder. Now what I need to do is lay out the largest rib, which will be this one. Strip off some wood this thickness. I want to make 1/8 inch. Strip it off so that I can start with this high point and just put a gradual curve in here, and then I can exponentially shorten the curve on each piece. I'll make them a little bit oversized, and then when I get the final, all the rib shapes in, I can block sand it down, and then I can also then put the little bit of a curve that I'm going to need to get into the hinge line here. Kind of a straightforward thing. It just takes a little bit of planning, and I hope that's one of the things I've been successful at doing, especially making I-beam flaps, which we've had on several models. Making an I-beam rudder, it's a little confusing, but if you ever made, let's say, a Juno or any of that that type of plane, you can pretty much, once you make one part, you can go out and make tails, wings, almost anything, even rudders. Now, the easiest way to do this, and I like to do this whenever possible, is use up little pieces of scrap that I know the wood is. This is an excellent piece of wood. This is one of those pieces of 3-pound balsa, and being it's way in the back of the plane, I want to just strip off enough to cut my ribs out of. Remember that old tip, keep the lightest wood in the back of the plane and on the inboard tip. No sense putting it on, making the outboard tip out of a 3-pound piece of balsa wood. I can just make up a whole bunch of these oversized. And it's only the back curve that I'm interested in. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what the curve is going to look like. You don't even need a template. Just leave it oversized for now. Eyeball fit is plenty good. Now, what you want to do, I want to replicate this. Let me figure out how many times. And then as I get, in other words, once I move these up, the curve will just start to move up. You just start trimming off one edge of it as you go down, almost like making an I-beam wing. Now you can just take each one of these individually. You want to get a little bit of an angle to match the trailing edge so you don't get a big glob of glue in there. Like to get a nice fit. Cut these a little bit oversized and just sand them right in position. Now again, before I put a drop of glue on this, I like to get them all tacked in, because what I want to do is look from the back and make sure they're all lined up. So they would be like crooked or something like that. It's easy if you just get one drop of glue holding every one on, right maybe in the middle, and then you can do a little fine tuning on it. At this stage, it's not important that these ribs even conform, because we're going to block sand them all down. But it is important when I do the other side to make sure that from the back I can see each one individually, because as this comes to a point on the rudder, if they're off even a little bit, you can really see it. You see from the back, they both line up
and I'll just work my way right up to the top. I've been looking for a lot of ways to use that, but it really takes some material off. It really brings the ribs right into pretty good alignment. Of course, I'll use a hand block to finish it up, but really roughs it out nice without breaking any ribs. My problem is, I notice I got a piece of rough sandpaper on there. I'm going to see if I can get a piece of the smoother paper. It's taking too much material off at once. But again, if you have one of these tools, this is a good time to experiment with it. See, what's nice about hook and latch, you can just replace the sandpaper in a couple of seconds. Again, as we go along, I want to try to find more and more uses for this. It's certainly useful doing cowls, that's for sure. Now, this is a little bit, it's soft anyway.
A lot nicer finish on with the smooth paper. I'm trying to work up to the line where I know the thickness that I want to arrive at the very end.
Some idea how quick those ribs, the rough part of it comes into shape. I see this side, they're all uneven. In a couple of minutes I can bring them all right up. Good tool. This is one of these rubber, I don't know what you call them, squeegees, and some 320 paper. What's nice you can do with this is if you roll up the edges, it's just soft enough that what you can do is you can drag it across the ribs without breaking ribs, and you can get the final. Now, see, I want to get the leading edge radius in. What happens if you do it with the sandpaper this way, you're going to catch that sandpaper on the rib every time. So what this does, it gives you a little radius, that front of the sandpaper edge. I want to radius this in. I want to constantly be going over to the fuselage and checking the fit, that I'm not making it too thin here. Now I've got all my ribs lined up, and then I want to get a real nice fine edge on the back, and get some thin CA right along the edge to harden it up all along that edge. That edge and down here is always vulnerable right up until you cover it. Now, it's these edges that always take a beating, even while you're working on a model. And because this model, I really would like to have all the edges perfect on everything, but even more so on this one, when you have a built-up surface, if that edge gets a ding in it, really difficult to repair. This edge here is going to take a beating. In fact, I may have to put a piece of 64th plywood on that. That's one of the things that very vulnerable out at the tip there until it's silt span. And one of the most, I guess, the common things I've ever heard about people that are watching videos for the first or second time, where they say, ooh, that's such a good idea, putting a CA along the edge to harden the wood. Well, it really is a good idea. I know I'm clumsy and I tend to hit things, and when you get an edge that's really nice and fine, well, it's really aggravating to get a ding in it. Once that's down in position now, I don't want to use any kicker on it at all. Now I can start to make a razor blade out of it. Or as Joe Adamusco used to always tell me when he would be down the house, I love those razor edges on your phone. Most people leave the trailing edge fat like a kibasi. Well, even if you can pick one or two things up off every tape, it's worth the time and energy of watching it. Really wanted to check that you had all the ribs in good alignment. What you can do is take some colored chalk and put it on each one. I like to use my finger, make sure I don't have any hard spots. But that radius soft block is a good way to do it too. You can pretty much see when you have a razor edge on everything, you know you've got them. Or if you run your finger this way, you know you have a nice smooth curve. And of course you can sight down and just see. What I want to see is that I have the thickness here pretty correct. Especially up here. In fact, I could thin this out just a little bit. Now, this could be just a tad thinner. Before I go on to any step, I want to have this, I'm just trying to do rough dimensions here, but a little thicker, a little thinner would definitely be in order here. It's important to get this dimension right because you're going to see this from the top. Because I know, common sense would tell me that eventually this is going to take a beating from wiping a model off or having clumsy people launch the plane, they'll hook their shirt in that or something. So just to give it a little insurance policy here, what I want to do is lay out a little piece of this in 64th plywood, and that'll ensure, hopefully partially ensure that I won't get that point broken off. And it did. The Spitfire stood the test of time, so I guess I should take that as a lesson. I want to get an accurate match here, so I can slip that right over. What that'll do, that'll help maintain that edge that goes along the top and the bottom too. And of course I'll cut this just a little bit oversized and then using a Dremel tool or a sanding block get it right in. I'm not going to even try to get it exactly to that shape. But that should add a little durability to that point. And again, when you're doing a scale model, every scale model has vulnerable parts that you have to pretty much take into account. Unless you have real delicate little fingers, and believe me, nobody I know, nobody in this shop has delicate fingers. it's a lot of times you spend a lot of time doing little details like this. In this case, it's just sanding out the rudders, taking the better part of a session. And you think, oh, gee, I'm wasting my time or something. But in the overall appearance of the plane, all of the little details, to me, the details are what makes all of the front row planes, front, second row planes, it separates them. The ones that are really nicely detailed and the ones that just have, yeah, they just take the cheap way out, an easy way out. I want to do the same thing for this edge. I want to make sure I got a nice true edge there. Repeat the same little thing up at the top. Well, in essence, that was 2 plywood edges. This point here is another vulnerable part of the plane. When you ripen it off and guys are launching it with boxing gloves and they've had too many beers and who knows what. That's my friends. A little bit like a stingray, doesn't it? Well, it really does add that last little final touch. It's a perfect fit. And that's the little details. That's the details that separate, I guess, front rows from front rows, or whatever you want to call it. That is a nice little detail touch. Well, the next step is I want to make the rudder linkage. I want to make the little horn. Now notice, there's a couple of constraints that we're working around. First off, I would like to have the horn itself be directly in line with the center of the elevators. Now I know where that's going to be, so I can plot that out. I don't want to have the linkage bending down or bending up. I lose my controls the control that I know has worked in the past. I don't want to go off on a tangent because this works so well the way we had this set up. Now, to desensitize this, I would have to make a horn that would ultimately wind up hitting the elevators. I don't want to do that. So the exchange in that is I move the horn further back from the hinge line. By moving it back from the hinge line, it accomplishes almost the same thing as moving it out here. It changes the pivot point. And if you work right off the Spitfire plan, for any ship, those ratios work really well. And it's been on so many other tapes, there's no point going back and doing it over again. But if you work off of these ratios, and they are really, really accurate, that works on one ship right after another. Even Joe's ship, when we set it up and bench trimmed it, one turn in, one turn out, done. Now you can see we've had real good luck, again, using these ratios. And I don't want to fool with these ratios at all. For a starting point, if you're going to duplicate a plane, or even if you're making your own plane and you want to have a good ballpark rudder adjustment, just get the Spitfire plan, trace it, copy it. It's already been published in Stunt News. You don't even have to go and buy the plans. You can just go steal it right off the plans. It works well, exactly as shown. So the first thing is to plot exactly where on here I want to have the horn, and then make it up out of laminated 64th plywood with the grain going cross grain. All that stuff is shown on the Spitfire plan. Another trick here is just cut one piece out, and each time you laminate it to the next piece of 64th plywood, move the grain in a different direction. 4 pieces is enough. An easy way to dress this off is just take it over to the sanding belt, even it all up. reason I prefer to use these, or make my own horn, I like to be able to paint it. I don't like the look of a big white or black horn sticking out. Just another detail touch. I want to lay out the holes, and this will be ready to, well, we don't put this in until it's tissue covered, but it'll be ready, then I can put this aside. Now the idea of keeping all the holes in alignment, well, let's go over this real quick. If you have the horn and it's set back or set forward from the rudder, what happens is when you want to move the linkage out for more travel or less travel into one of the other holes, you have to redo your whole adjustment because the horn is in a different position. So it's real important to keep this at 90 degrees to the rudder, the selection of holes that you're going to use, because then you can go from, let's say, medium travel, less, more and more and more, depending on how you want to trim the plane and what prop is going to be on the plane. So it's real important to have all the holes at a direct 90 degree to the center line of the rudder if you want to have the most effective wave rudder that you can. What I've done this year is just add a couple of extra holes so I have even a little more adjustment inner and outer, and I've used on both of the planes, all three of them, I've used all the travel, all the different options that I have, and you get a lot of different options. You wouldn't want to just have one hole or two. Make as many as you can, the whole length of the horn. Just like adjustable readout, it's crazy to have adjustable readouts, and when you move them as far forward as they'll go, it's not far enough. So I know the horn is going to go right here now, so what I want to do, I want to put a duplicate rib in here. I don't want to glue this in until all the tissuing is done. And in effect, I'll have a little notch, I'll tissue over this, and then drop this in and glue it. And if I glue it now, the problem is it's pretty simple. I have to tissue around it, and it's really difficult getting that tissue to stick in a small area without a wrinkle. So again, it's like that little cover that goes over the push rod on the profile. Why make it difficult for yourself? Always figure out how to make it as easy as possible. Stuff is difficult enough. I can trace out an 1/8 inch doubler here. You'll save yourself a little work if you can. That's so important. Now the whole idea of this is once I sand this radius in, after it's all tissued, I can cut that out, drop the horn in. And if you don't think that saves you time, you try tissuing around it. Now, of course, I just take a sanding block and carefully dress that edge off. Before I go any further, I want to radius all these little edges off since we've got the shape close. Now you get some tubing with a sharp edge and twist it through. Give yourself some lightning holes, randomly placed. Now one thing for sure you want to do is every time you punch a hole, you want to get the piece out. What happens if they start backing up in here, then it's a real problem, and then you wind up just crushing the piece out. Don't do what I've done before, is hold my finger back here and then wind up putting a hole in your finger. Nice way to lighten up a part. And obviously this is weight that's just going along for the ride. Get rid of the piece after each. I look like loading a cannon here. I realize this piece is so rigid, I can remove all that webbing there now. It's nice and stiff. Got a lot of cross grain going on. So let me lighten it up even a little more.
That ends another lovely day in the life of the high-beam Spitfire. Well, like a lot of experiments that don't really work out the way you plan, the Kevlar material, as strong as it is not really going to be a good choice for a cowling on, at least this material anyway, being so thick. It doesn't want to conform to the sides and edges. It's just, you could get away with doing it if you were to cut pieces and sections, and that isn't really the way I want to lay these up anyway, but it was a good experiment. It's one of the things that it always pays to do, just so you know for yourself. And what I'm going to do is make one of these up out of the normal fiberglass procedure, just so I have one to use for a test. Now, this is going to be a different size opening, and maybe I'll have to carve a new piece, but I want to see how close I can get this to come. Maybe it's going to be close enough. I doubt it, though. This is a much thicker, wider fuselage, so it's probably, so you always want to take a chance that you can do this, but the reality is, I know I'm probably going to have to carve another block. Now we'll close out the video with a couple of photos came in today from Joe Ortiz, and he said, boy, they're having a great time. Down in Arizona, the sun never stops shining. Joe, enjoy it. You deserve it. Nice picture of Joe back a couple of years ago. He was helping a bunch of juniors out at Flushing. A good man. And we'll end the video. This is Joe's latest creation, the Arizona Monster. And we hope to have some pictures of this finished flying, winning VSC, winning the Nats, whatever. Anyway, thanks for joining us. It's been fun, and it's been a real adventure getting this plane underway, but I feel like we're finally on the way to having a real airplane under our wing to add to our Air Force. Well, in the ongoing saga of the Nobler, the Brodak Nobler, we also had Bill Mazzoni donate a set of real banner reels and a real Vico spinner. Bill, thanks a whole lot for me and Kenny both. It's really going to add a nice dimension to the plane. Especially, look at all those old pictures that are somewhere on this tape of those Cleveland Noblers. They all had the banner reels painted with the little designs on them and everything. A nice touch. Bill, thanks a lot. See, this is what makes modeling special to me, is when you have people all around the country here, like Bill, donating things into the cause. Bill, we're going to find something to send you, but I don't know what. I know you collect Lionel trains. Maybe we'll find a nice GG1 or... Nah, I don't think so. I'll keep it for myself.